You're telling me 12 certified technicians and $250,000 worth of diagnostics can't start a helicopter? The voice cut through the heat like a blade, sharp and impatient. Carrying across the open tarmac where the UH-72 Lakota sat motionless under the late morning sun, its rotor blades hanging slack, lifeless against a sky that shimmered at 92 degrees, the air thick enough to taste. And around it a cluster of men in pressed uniforms and oil-stained gloves stood frozen between frustration and embarrassment as laptop screens glowed green, with perfect system checks that all told the same quiet lie. Everything was fine. Everything was operational. Everything should have worked, and yet the aircraft refused to respond, refused to breathe, refused to even acknowledge the ignition sequence that had been cycled again and again until the procedure itself felt hollow, mechanical, meaningless, while Evan Kessler wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, smearing a thin line of grease along his temple as he stepped back from the open panel with a muttered curse, his boots grinding against the sun-baked concrete, the sound dry and brittle like something about to crack, because nothing in his training had prepared him for this kind of failure, not when every indicator, every sensor, every carefully engineered system insisted the machine was ready to fly. Lieutenant Mason Reed stood just behind him, arms crossed tight against his chest, posture rigid with the kind of authority that had been earned more in classrooms than in chaos, his eyes flicking between the silent helicopter and the growing line of black SUVs parked beyond the perimeter where senior officers and invited guests waited under a shaded viewing stand, the schedule slipping further with every passing minute, the demonstration already delayed by 45. And somewhere behind them the low murmur of expectation was beginning to shift into something sharper, less forgiving. Reed's jaw tightened as he checked his watch again, the polished face catching a harsh glint of sunlight. "We don't have the luxury of guessing, Kessler," he said, his voice clipped, controlled, but carrying an edge that betrayed the pressure building beneath it. "The general wants this bird in the air in the next 10 minutes. Kessler let out a short, humorless laugh, stepping away from the engine cowling and gesturing toward the array of equipment spread across the mobile workbench. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, we've run every diagnostic twice. Fuel lines are clean, ignition's hot, voltage is stable. The ECU is reading perfect across the board. This thing should be flying already." He paused, looking back at the helicopter as if it had personally insulted him. "But it's not." The words hung there, heavy and unresolved, and for a moment no one spoke. The only sound the faint ticking of cooling metal and the distant hum of generators from the far side of the base. A sound so ordinary it only made the silence here feel more wrong, more pronounced, like something essential was missing, something no system could measure. Reed exhaled slowly through his nose, trying to hold the situation together with sheer discipline. "Then find what we missed," he said, but the command lacked the certainty it was meant to carry, because deep down he knew the same thing Kessler did. They hadn't missed anything that the system was capable of showing them, and that was the problem, because the system was all they had been taught to trust, all they had been trained to rely on, and now it was failing them in the most public way possible. Just beyond the temporary barrier, a small figure stood. Apart from the controlled chaos, not close enough to be part of it, but not far enough to be ignored entirely. Walter Boone rested his weight evenly on both feet, shoulders slightly stooped beneath a faded olive jacket that had seen more years than most of the men working the aircraft, his hands tucked loosely into the pockets as he watched the Lakota with a quiet, unblinking focus that seemed almost out of place against the frantic energy surrounding it. He didn't look at the screens, didn't glance at the manuals or the tools. His attention stayed fixed on the machine itself, on the subtle stillness of it, as if he were listening for something beneath the silence, something the others couldn't hear. Reed noticed him then, the unfamiliar shape at the edge of a restricted space, and immediately his expression hardened, irritation finding an easy target. He stepped away from the crew, boots striking the concrete with deliberate authority as he approached. "Sir, this area is restricted," he said, the words "sir" delivered out of habit more than respect. "You're going to need to step back behind the barrier." Walter's eyes shifted from the helicopter to the young officer, pale and steady, carrying a depth that made Reed feel, for just a second, like he'd walked into a conversation already in progress. "The general asked me to come." Walter said, his voice low, roughened by age but anchored with a weight that didn't ask for belief. Reed blinked once, caught off guard by the calm certainty, then shook it off with a faint scoff. The general asked for a lot of things today, he replied, gesturing back toward the grounded aircraft. None of them include unscheduled visitors on my flight line. Behind him, Kessler glanced over, catching the exchange, and let out a short chuckle as he walked closer, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since given up trying to be clean. "What's this?" he said, looking Walter up and down with open amusement. "We calling in historical consultants now." A few of the younger techs smirked, the tension of failure finding relief in something easier to dismiss, something safer to mock. Kessler tilted his head toward the silent helicopter. "Unless you've got a laptop with a better diagnostic suite in that jacket, old-timer, I think we've got it covered." Walter didn't respond right away, his gaze drifting back to the aircraft, to the way the rotor sat just a fraction off-center, to the way the heat shimmered distorted the edges of the engine housing, to the quiet that didn't belong. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to defend himself, it wasn't to argue. It was just a simple observation, almost to himself. "She's not supposed to sound like that." Kessler frowned, confusion flickering into annoyance. "Sound like what?" Walter didn't answer, because to him the problem wasn't in what the helicopter was doing, it was in what it wasn't, and that difference was something no screen could ever explain. The moment stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind of pause where everyone present understood that whatever came next would not be undone easily. And Lieutenant Mason Reed felt the weight of it settle across his shoulders as he looked from the sealed panel to Evan Kessler, and then, almost reluctantly, back to Walter Boone, whose stillness had not changed, whose presence remained steady in a way that made the chaos around them feel temporary, almost superficial. Reed drew in a slow breath, the dry heat catching slightly in his throat, and made the decision before he could talk himself out of it. "Open it," he said, the words firm but quieter than his earlier commands, and for a split second no one moved, as if the order itself needed to be processed, translated from something theoretical into something real. Kessler blinked once, the resistance immediate and instinctive. "Lieutenant, that panel is sealed for a reason," he said, his tone controlled but tight. "There is no indication of failure in that subsystem. Opening it means breaking protocol, filing a report, grounding the aircraft longer than we already have." Reed did not look away this time. His gaze locked on Kessler with a steadiness that mirrored, in a smaller way, the calm he had seen in Walter. "We are already grounded," he replied, and the simplicity of the statement left little room for argument. "Open it." The second time carried more weight, less doubt. Kessler exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a measured release as he turned toward the panel, his movements deliberate now, precise, as if by executing them perfectly, he could still maintain control over the situation. One of the technicians stepped forward with the appropriate tools, the polished metal catching the sunlight as it was passed into Kessler's hand. And for a moment he hesitated, not visibly, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough for him to feel it, that small internal resistance that came from stepping outside the boundaries of what he knew to be correct. Then he set the tool against the first fastener and began to loosen it. The sound was subtle, a faint metallic click that seemed louder than it should have been in the surrounding quiet. One by one the fasteners came free, each turn of the tool marking a step further away from certainty, further into something that could not be justified by data alone. Caleb Shaw found himself leaning forward slightly, his attention narrowing to the small movements of Kessler's hands, to the gradual separation of the panel from the body of the aircraft. And as the final fastener came loose, Kessler placed his fingers along the edge and pulled it free. The panel lifted away cleanly, revealing the components behind it. And for a second nothing seemed different. Everything appeared as it should, clean lines, intact connections, no obvious damage, no glaring fault. Kessler let out a breath that was almost a scoff, ready to turn back and dismiss the entire exercise. "There is nothing here," he began, but Walter stepped closer then. Not quickly, not intrusively, just enough to shift the space. His eyes moving over the exposed section with a quiet focus that contrasted sharply with the tension around him. He did not reach in immediately, did not touch anything. He simply looked, his head tilting slightly as if aligning himself with a memory rather than a diagram. The heat shimmered off the metal, distorting the edges of the components, and for a brief moment the present seemed to blur with something older, something deeper. Walter's hand moved at last, slow and steady, reaching into the open panel with a familiarity that did not come from manuals or schematics, his fingers brushing lightly against a line, then pausing at a junction point that looked, to everyone else, exactly like it should. He pressed gently, testing resistance, feeling for something that could not be measured by a sensor. Then he withdrew his hand and glanced toward Kessler. "Run it again," he said, the request simple, direct. Kessler hesitated, his eyes flicking from Walter to the exposed panel and back. Again, uncertainty now mixing with a reluctant curiosity. "You did not fix anything," he said, the words sounding weaker than he intended. Walter shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he replied. "Just listen." The phrase landed with the same quiet weight as before, and this time, no one laughed. Reed gave a short nod, signaling the technician to proceed, and once again the start sequence was initiated. The familiar progression began, the subtle shift in system readiness, the expectation building toward the moment that had failed them repeatedly. And then something changed, not dramatically, not in a way that could be immediately pointed out, but enough for Walter to notice, enough for Caleb to feel. A slight variation in the rhythm of the sequence, a hesitation that had not been there before. Walter leaned in just a fraction, his eyes narrowing as he focused on that difference. "There," he said quietly, and his hand moved again, this time more certain, reaching into the panel to adjust a component by the smallest margin, a movement so precise it was almost invisible, and then he stepped back. "Now," he said. Kessler did not argue this time, did not question. He simply nodded to the technician, and the sequence was run again. And this time the silence that followed was not the same as before. It was thinner, less absolute, as if something had shifted just enough to allow the possibility of change. And in that fragile space, every person on the tarmac felt it. The realization that the problem they had been facing was not beyond them, not unsolvable, but simply hidden in a place they had not thought to look. And as the system prepared to cycle once more, the line between doubt and belief began to blur, leaving only the quiet anticipation of what would happen next. The sequence engaged again with a low electronic hum that seemed to ripple through the body of the helicopter. And this time every man standing within 20 feet leaned in without realizing it, drawn by a change so subtle it would have gone unnoticed an hour earlier, but now felt unmistakable. The system cycled through its checks with the same perfect confidence, the same rows of green confirmations. But beneath that surface something else had shifted, something small, something almost reluctant, like a machine reconsidering its own certainty. Walter Boone did not look at the screen, did not glance at the indicators. His attention remained fixed on the open panel, on the junction he had touched, his head slightly inclined as if listening for a sound that had not yet fully formed. "Again," he said quietly, before the sequence had even completed, and this time there was no hesitation, no questioning. The technician reset the cycle immediately, fingers moving faster now, driven not by instruction but by expectation. The second run began, and the difference became clearer, a faint tremor somewhere, deep within the system, not enough to register as movement, not enough to trigger any alert, but enough to break the perfect stillness that had defined every previous attempt. Evan Kessler felt it before he understood it, his body reacting to the change in a way his training could not immediately explain, his eyes darting from the panel to the engine housing, searching for confirmation that the system itself refused to provide. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. Walter did not answer right away, his hand moving once more toward the open section, this time with a steadiness that came from recognition rather than exploration. His fingers adjusted the same component again, just a fraction, a movement so precise it seemed almost insignificant, and yet it carried a confidence that no diagnostic tool had shown all morning. "She is trying," Walter said, and the choice of words should have sounded strange, should have drawn another round of skepticism, but it did not. Not now, not after what they had just felt. Lieutenant Mason Reed stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the panel, on Walter's hand, on the exact point where the adjustment had been made. Trying what? He asked, and for the first time his tone held something new. Not authority, not doubt, but genuine curiosity. Walter leaned back slightly, giving the space a moment to settle. Trying to tell you where the resistance is, he replied, his voice calm, measured, as if explaining. Something simple, something obvious. Kessler shook his head instinctively, the habit of logic pushing back against the unfamiliar explanation. That is not how systems work, he said, but even as he spoke, the words felt less solid, less reliable, because what they were seeing did not fit within the framework he had relied on. Walter glanced at him then, not dismissive, not confrontational, just patient. That is exactly how systems work, he said. You just stopped listening when they started talking in a way you did not expect. The statement settled heavily, not because it was complex, but because it forced a shift in perspective, one that none of them had been trained to make. Caleb Shaw felt a quiet certainty growing in his chest, the kind that did not come from understanding every detail, but from recognizing the pattern beneath them. He stepped closer as well, his eyes tracing the line from the junction to the adjacent components, noticing now the slight misalignment, the almost invisible tension in the connection, something that would never have triggered a fault code, never have appeared on a screen, but was present all the same. There, he said softly, pointing just below, where Walter had adjusted. It is not seated right. Kessler followed his indication, leaning in to examine the area more closely, and for the first time he saw it, not clearly, not as a glaring defect, but as a subtle inconsistency, a fraction of an inch, a difference so small it would have been dismissed instantly under normal circumstances, and yet now it stood out, undeniable in its quiet imperfection. He reached in carefully, his fingers testing the connection, feeling the slight resistance that should not have been there. That is not possible, he murmured again, but the words carried no conviction this time, only realization. Walter stepped back, allowing Kessler the space to work, his role shifting without announcement, without ceremony, from outsider to something else entirely, something the others had not yet named. It does not have to be possible, he said. It just has to be real. Kessler adjusted the connection slowly, aligning it with a precision that matched the care Walter had shown, the movement deliberate, respectful, as if he were handling something fragile, something that demanded attention beyond procedure. And when he finished, he withdrew his hand and looked to Reed, a silent question passing between them. Reed nodded once, the decision already made. Run it, he said, and the technician initiated the sequence again. The system responded as it always had, flawless in its reporting, confident in its readiness. But this time the silence that followed was different, thinner, less complete. And then, for the first time since the problem had begun, there was a sound, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the background noise of the bass, a low, tentative stir deep within the engine housing, like a breath drawn after a long pause. Every head turned toward it, every eye fixed on the aircraft as the sound grew. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, a shift from stillness to motion, from absence to presence. And in that moment the entire dynamic of the tarmac changed, the frustration, the doubt, the certainty that had defined the past hour all giving way to something else, something quieter but far more powerful, the recognition that the solution had not been hidden by complexity, but by simplicity, by a detail too small for the system to flag and too subtle for anyone to notice until someone who knew how to listen had stepped in and shown them where to look. The sound built slowly, not as a roar but as a presence, a low mechanical awakening that seemed to ripple through the frame of the helicopter, subtle at first, almost hesitant, like something remembering how to move after being still for too long. And every man on the tarmac felt it before they fully registered what it meant. Evan Kessler did not speak, did not move. His eyes locked on the engine housing as the faint vibration strengthened, traveling through the metal skin into the ground. Beneath their boots, a living response where there had been nothing but silence before. "Keep it going," Lieutenant Mason Reed said, his voice controlled but edged with something new, something that sounded almost like relief held tightly in check. The technician nodded and maintained the sequence, hands steady now, no longer repeating a procedure out of obligation, but guiding something that was finally beginning to answer. The rotor above them shifted, just a fraction, the blade angle adjusting as the system transitioned from dormant to active. And that small movement carried more weight than any display reading could have, because it was real, because it could be seen, because it could be felt. Caleb Shaw let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his eyes following the slow, deliberate motion overhead, the sunlight catching along the edge of the blade as it moved, reflecting in brief flashes that marked each incremental step toward life. Walter Boone stood exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, his hands now resting loosely at his sides, his gaze steady on the aircraft. But there was a shift in him as well, subtle, almost invisible, a quiet easing of tension that came not from surprise, but from confirmation, as if the outcome had never truly been in doubt. Kessler finally turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at Walter. And in that brief look there was no mockery left, no dismissal, only a growing awareness that the man standing beside them understood something he did not, something no system had shown him, something no training module had prepared him to see. "It is stabilizing," one of the technicians said, his voice low but clear, reading the physical cues now instead of the screen, the engine response smoothing out, the vibrations settling into a consistent rhythm. Reed stepped closer to the aircraft, his attention fully engaged, no longer divided between procedure and expectation. "Monitor it," he ordered. Though the command felt different now, less about control, more about observation, Walter took a slow step forward, his eyes still fixed on the open panel. And for a moment the sounds of the present seemed to fall away, replaced by something older, something carried not in memory as a story, but as a sensation. The way the air moved when a rotor found its balance, the way the frame responded when tension released correctly, the way a machine communicated through vibration long before any gauge could confirm it. And in that quiet overlap between past and present, his hand lifted again, not out of urgency, but out of instinct, reaching once more into the open section, his fingers brushing lightly along the adjusted connection, feeling the difference now, the absence of resistance that had been there before, the alignment settling into place. And for just a second the world around him shifted, the clean lines of the modern tarmac dissolving into something harsher, more unpredictable, a different kind of heat, a different kind of noise, where the same sound he heard now had once meant something far more immediate, far more critical, a signal that a machine had decided to keep going when it did not have to. The moment passed quickly, leaving only the present, the steady rise of the engine, the growing confidence in its response. Walter withdrew his hand and stepped back again, his role once more receding into the background. Kessler watched him closely now, not as an outsider, but as a point of reference, his mind racing to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he believed about systems and diagnostics. "We missed it," he said quietly, the admission not directed at anyone in particular, but carrying enough weight to be heard. Reed did not respond immediately, his focus still on the aircraft, but the truth of the statement settled in all the same. Caleb glanced between them, feeling the shift ripple through the group, the unspoken recognition that the failure had not been in the machine, but in their approach to it. The rotor gained speed gradually, the movement no longer tentative, the blades cutting through the hot air with increasing confidence, each rotation smoother than the last, until the rhythm became steady, controlled, alive, the sound filling the space that had been empty before, and with it came a change in the atmosphere of the tarmac itself, the tension easing, the frustration giving way to something quieter, something more reflective. Reed finally exhaled, a slow release of the pressure he had been carrying since the first failed attempt, and turned his attention back to Walter, studying him for a long second, as if trying to understand not just what he had done, but how he had known to do it. "You said it was not supposed to sound like that," Reed said, his voice measured, thoughtful. Walter met his gaze, his expression calm, almost distant. "Machines talk," he replied simply. "You just have to know when they are being honest." The answer was not technical, not detailed, but it carried a clarity that made further explanation unnecessary. Kessler looked back at the open panel, then at his own hands, still holding the tool he had used to remove it, and for the first time since the problem had begun, he did not feel certain, not in the way he had before, but the uncertainty was not uncomfortable, it was instructive. Reminder that knowledge did not always come from what was displayed in front of you. Sometimes it came from what you were willing to notice when everything else insisted there was nothing to see. And as the helicopter continued to come alive before them, the line between experience and system, between instinct and procedure, became something far less rigid than it had been just minutes earlier, leaving behind a quiet understanding that would not be easily forgotten. The rotor gained momentum with a steady, controlled rhythm, each rotation cutting cleaner through the hot afternoon air until the helicopter no longer looked like a grounded machine, but something poised, something ready, and the shift in energy across the tarmac was immediate, visible not just in the aircraft, but in the posture of every person standing near it, shoulders straightening, voices lowering, movements becoming more deliberate as the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. Evan Kessler stepped back slowly, his eyes still fixed on the engine housing as if expecting it to fail again, as if waiting for the system to correct itself and prove that this moment was a fluke. But it did not. The vibration remained consistent, the sound steady, the response exactly as it should have been from the beginning. "It is holding," one of the technicians confirmed, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that had not fully faded. Lieutenant Mason Reed nodded once, the tension that had defined his commands earlier now replaced by a quieter focus. "Continue monitoring," he said, though the urgency was gone, replaced by something more controlled, more measured, as if the situation had shifted from crisis to confirmation. Walter Boone had already taken a step back from the aircraft, his presence receding almost as naturally as it had entered, his eyes still on the helicopter for a moment longer before drifting toward the edge of the tarmac, as if his part in the moment had ended the instant the machine began to respond. Caleb Shaw noticed it first, the way Walter moved without drawing attention, the way he seemed to step out of the center of the scene just as easily as he had stepped into it. And something about that felt wrong, not because it was inappropriate, but because it did not match the significance of what had just happened. Caleb glanced toward Reed, then back to Walter, hesitation flickering across his expression before he spoke. "Sir," he said quietly, addressing Reed, "we should log who made the adjustment." The suggestion was simple, procedural, but it carried an implication that extended beyond paperwork. Reed followed Caleb's gaze and saw Walter nearing the boundary line. The faded jacket, the slow, steady pace. And for a moment he said nothing, as if considering how to respond. Then he turned back toward Kessler. "Document the panel adjustment," he said, his tone neutral, but when he looked again toward Walter, there was something else there, something closer to recognition. Kessler hesitated, his hand still resting on the tool he had used earlier. And for the first time since he had taken charge of the situation, he did not immediately move to comply. His eyes followed Walter as well. The earlier arrogance replaced by a quieter awareness that what had just occurred did not fit neatly into a report, did not translate easily into data fields and system notes. "Yes, sir," he said finally, though the words felt incomplete, as if they acknowledged the instruction but not the reality behind it. Beyond the barrier, a subtle shift had begun among the waiting vehicles, doors opening, figures stepping out, the controlled stillness of anticipation giving way to movement as word traveled faster than sound, carried by glances, by gestures, by the unmistakable change in the posture of those closest to the aircraft. General Thomas Avery stepped into the sunlight. With a measured pace, his uniform immaculate, his presence commanding without effort, and his eyes went directly to the helicopter, not to the crew, not to the equipment, but to the aircraft itself, reading the signs that others were only beginning to understand. The steady rotation, the consistent tone, the absence of hesitation, and then his gaze shifted, moving across the tarmac until it found Walter Boone, just as he reached the edge of the restricted area, and for a brief second something in the general's expression changed, subtle but unmistakable, a recognition that went beyond rank or protocol. Reed saw it happen, saw the exact moment the general's focus locked onto Walter, and felt a quiet realization settle in his chest. The kind that arrives without explanation but leaves no room for doubt. This was not coincidence. This was not luck. Kessler noticed it too. The way the general adjusted his path, no longer heading toward the aircraft, but toward the man who had just walked away from it. And the implications of that shift landed harder than any words could have. Caleb straightened instinctively, his attention snapping to the approaching figure, the air around them seeming to tighten once more, not with tension this time, but with something closer to anticipation. Walter paused as the general drew near, not turning immediately, not reacting with surprise, as if he had sensed the approach before it was visible, and when he finally turned, his expression remained calm, unchanged, the same quiet steadiness that had defined him from the beginning. The general stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, close enough for those nearby to hear if they listened carefully. But for a moment he said nothing, his eyes studying Walter with a depth that suggested memory rather than curiosity. Reed found himself holding his breath without realizing it, the scene unfolding in front of him carrying a weight he could not yet fully understand. Kessler stood still, the tool still in his hand, the significance of the moment pressing in from all sides, because whatever was about to happen next was not part of any procedure, not something that could be logged or explained. It was something else entirely, something that had been set in motion long before this day, long before this aircraft had ever failed to start. And as the rotor continued its steady rotation behind them, the sound now a constant presence instead of an absence, the focus of the entire tarmac shifted away from the machine and toward the two men standing face to face, one in a perfectly pressed uniform, the other in a worn jacket that carried no visible rank. And yet, in that moment, it was not immediately clear which one held the greater weight of history. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the steady hum of the helicopter fading into the background as General Thomas Avery stood facing Walter Boone, his posture straight, his presence commanding, but his eyes carried something else entirely, something that did not belong to rank or authority, something older, something personal. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but edged with a weight that carried across the immediate circle around them. "You took your time," he said, and the words, simple as they were, landed with a familiarity that did not match the formality of the setting. Walter's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his stance, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. "You did not need me until now," he replied, his tone calm, steady, carrying none of the deference that most would have shown in front of a general, and yet there was no disrespect in it, only truth. Avery let out a slow breath, the faintest hint of a smile touching the corner of his mouth before fading just as quickly. "That sounds about right," he said, and for a second the tension around them eased, not because the situation had lost its weight, but because it had found its context. Lieutenant Mason Reed stood a few steps behind, his mind racing to process what he was witnessing. The exchange unfolding in front of him did not fit within any structure he understood. There was no introduction, no clarification, no formal acknowledgement, just a conversation that carried the quiet certainty of two men who did not need to explain themselves to each other. Evan Kessler felt it too, the shift in the dynamic, the realization that the man he had dismissed less than an hour ago was now being addressed by the general in a way that bypassed every layer of protocol he had been trained to respect. Caleb Shaw watched closely, his attention fixed on the details others might miss, the way the general's shoulders had relaxed just slightly, the way his gaze held steady on Walter as if anchoring to something familiar, something remembered. "You kept her alive longer than anyone thought possible," Avery said after a brief pause, his voice quieter now, less formal, and the words seemed to reach beyond the present moment, beyond the aircraft behind them, into something that had happened long before this day. Walter's eyes shifted briefly toward the helicopter, then back to the general. "She did not want to go down," he said, and the phrasing was the same way he had spoken about the machine earlier, as if it were more than metal and systems. And for the first time, no one questioned it, no one dismissed it, because they had all just witnessed what that perspective could reveal. Avery nodded slowly, his gaze following Walter's for a second, taking in the steady rotation of the rotor, the smooth, controlled motion that had been impossible just minutes before. "Most people would have walked away," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Walter gave a small shrug, the movement understated, almost dismissive. "Most people were not there," he replied, and again, there was no need for elaboration. The meaning carried itself. Reed felt a quiet realization settle deeper now, not just about the situation, but about the man standing in front of him. The calm, the precision, the certainty, none of it had been accidental, none of it had been guesswork. It had come from somewhere else, somewhere that training and systems could not fully replicate. Kessler shifted his weight slightly, the tool still in his hand, now feeling out of place, irrelevant in a moment that had moved beyond technical solutions into something harder to define. Avery's attention returned fully to Walter, and for a second the two men simply looked at each other, the silence between them not empty, but full, carrying the weight of shared history that no one else present could fully understand. Then the general straightened just slightly, his posture returning to something closer to formal, though the underlying tone had not changed. "You always said the small things were the ones that mattered," he said, and there was a note of reflection in his voice now, as if repeating something he had learned long ago. Walter nodded once, his expression unchanged. "They are the ones people stop seeing," he replied, and the words seemed to echo across the tarmac in a way that went beyond the immediate conversation, because every person standing there knew exactly what he meant. They had lived it just minutes earlier. The overlooked detail, the unnoticed resistance, the assumption that everything was fine because the system said it was. Avery let the silence sit for a moment longer, then turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping across the crew, taking in Reed, Kessler, Caleb, the technicians, all of them standing a little straighter now, a little quieter, the earlier confidence replaced by something more measured, more aware. "You got it running," he said, his voice carrying again, not loud, but clear enough for all to hear. "That is what matters." But even as he said it, his eyes flicked back to Walter, and the acknowledgement in that glance carried more weight than the words themselves, because it made clear, without stating it outright, who had truly made the difference. Walter did not respond to the recognition, did not step forward or accept it. He simply inclined his head slightly, the gesture minimal, almost incidental, as if the outcome had never been about credit, never been about being seen, and that quiet refusal to claim the moment seemed to deepen its impact even further. Caleb felt it settle into him, the understanding that what he had witnessed was not just a solution to a technical problem, but a demonstration of something far more lasting, a way of seeing, a way of thinking, a kind of awareness that did not come from screens or systems, but from experience carried over time. Avery took a small step back, the conversation drawing to a close not with a formal ending, but with a mutual understanding that did not require one. And as the helicopter continued its steady operation behind them, the sound now strong, consistent, alive, the entire scene seemed to shift into a new balance, one where the machine was no longer the center of attention, but the result of something deeper, something that had just been revealed, if only for a moment, to those willing to notice it. The rotor settled into a full, confident rotation, the steady thrum now filling the air with a presence that felt almost deliberate, as if the machine itself had chosen to return rather than simply responding to a command. And across the tarmac the atmosphere shifted into something quieter, more grounded, the earlier urgency replaced by a stillness that carried weight instead of tension. General Thomas Avery turned slightly, his attention moving back to the aircraft one last time, taking in the smooth operation, the absence of hesitation, the quiet confirmation that everything was now exactly as it should have been from the start. Then he looked back at Walter Boone, and for a brief moment there was no rank between them, no visible hierarchy, just two men standing in the same space with a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. "It still listens to you," Avery said, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear. Walter gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze drifting toward the helicopter again. "It always did," he replied, and there was no pride in the statement, no claim, just a simple acknowledgement of something that had never changed. Lieutenant Mason Reed stood a few steps away, the weight of the moment settling fully into him now, not as confusion, but as clarity, the kind that reshapes how you see things rather than just explaining them. He glanced at Evan Kessler, noticing the way the technician's posture had shifted, the earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more deliberate, as if each movement now carried a measure of thought that had not been there before. Kessler looked down at the tool still in his hand, then slowly set it back onto the workbench. The metallic clink soft against the steady hum of the engine, And when he looked up again, his eyes went to Walter, not with skepticism, not with challenge, but with a recognition that had not existed an hour earlier. Caleb Shaw felt it as well, the quiet transformation in the space around him. The way the team now stood not as individuals defending their roles, but as people who had just witnessed something that changed how those roles fit together. Something that did not diminish their training, but expanded it. Avery took a step back, the movement subtle but definitive, signaling the end of the moment without needing to announce it. "Get it ready," he said, his voice returning to command, directed toward Reed and the crew. "We are not delaying this any longer." Reed nodded immediately, the response automatic but now grounded in a different kind of confidence. "Yes, sir," he replied, turning back toward the team with renewed focus, the procedures resuming, but with a shift in tone, less rigid, more aware, as if each step now carried an understanding of what lay beneath it. Walter did not wait for acknowledgement, did not linger for instruction. He simply turned and began to walk away from the tarmac, his pace unhurried, his posture unchanged, the worn jacket catching the light in brief flashes as he moved toward the edge of the restricted area. Caleb watched him go, a quiet hesitation rising in his chest, the sense that something important was leaving without being fully understood. He took a small step forward, then stopped, unsure of what he would even say if he called out, because there were no questions that felt large enough, no words that could capture what had just been shown. Kessler glanced at Reed, then back at Walter, and for a moment it looked like he might speak, might call after him, but he did not. The realization settling that some things were not meant to be explained in the moment, some things had to be carried forward and understood over time. Avery remained where he was for a second longer, his eyes following Walter until he reached the boundary, and there was a faint shift in his expression again. Something reflective, something that suggested this was not the first time he had watched that figure walk away after leaving something behind. Then the general turned back toward the helicopter, the present reclaiming its place as the priority, the demonstration moving forward as planned, the system now functioning, the machine now alive. And yet for those who had been closest to it, the focus had changed. The helicopter was no longer just a piece of equipment, no longer just a system to be managed. It had become a reminder, a reference point for something deeper, something that could not be captured in reports or diagnostics, something that existed in the space between observation and understanding. Reed moved along the line of the aircraft, checking positions, confirming readiness, his commands precise, but his attention sharper now, more attuned to the details that had once seemed too small to matter. Kessler followed, his movements steady, deliberate, each action informed not just by training, but by the memory of what he had almost missed. Caleb returned to his station, but his gaze lingered on the panel that had been opened, now closed again, sealed once more, looking exactly as it had before, and yet carrying a different meaning entirely, because now he knew what could exist behind a perfect surface, what could be overlooked when everything appeared correct. The rotor maintained its steady pace, the sound filling the air with a constant, grounding presence, and as the helicopter prepared to lift, the team around it stood not just ready, but changed. Their understanding expanded in a way that would not easily fade, and somewhere beyond the edge of the tarmac, Walter Boone continued walking, his figure growing smaller against the wide stretch of concrete and sky, leaving behind no formal recognition, no recorded credit, only the quiet impact of a moment that had shifted the balance between certainty and awareness, between what could be measured and what had to be noticed. And in that absence of acknowledgement, there was a final lesson, one that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. That respect was not something demanded in the moment, but something earned long before, carried quietly, and revealed only when it mattered most.